Welcome back to The Explainer. So, you know how the lyrics to some random, terrible pop song from like 2010 will just permanently stick in your brain, but complex math concepts completely vanish the second you close the book? Yeah, we've all been there. Well, you are in the right place, because today we are decoding Daniel Willingham's cognitive and neurological theory of learning. His approach is a total game changer. It focuses on the actual mechanics of memory, effort, and how our minds literally process information. And honestly, the insights we're going to cover today will fundamentally change how you view your own learning process.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. 1. How we actually learn. 2. The power of practice. 3. Applying the theory to teaching. 4. Developing social skills. And 5. Strengths and weaknesses.
Section 1. How we actually learn. Processing over progression.
Let's start with a really foundational question. How do we actually learn? For a long time, the dominant idea in education was that learning is just this natural progression. We simply wait for a child, or any student really, to become developmentally ready to learn something. But what if waiting for readiness is just totally the wrong approach?
This is where we see a massive paradigm shift. Think about Jean Piaget, an absolute giant in developmental psychology. He believed learning was this natural, almost biological progression toward adult thinking. But Willingham, he sharply disagrees. He argues that learning isn't a passive waiting game at all. It depends entirely on how we actively process information and skills. It's kind of like Carol Dweck's famous growth mindset. Willingham believes that sheer effort and practice are the absolute keys to success, rather than just sitting around waiting to naturally hit some developmental milestone.
The absolutely crucial point here is that Willingham establishes a strict order of operations for how we learn. Factual knowledge must always come before skill building. Always. Why? Well, because you literally can't build a skill out of thin air. Take reading, for instance. There's simply no way you can master the high-level skill of reading fluidly if you don't first have that basic factual knowledge of words and phonics. Facts are basically the raw materials you need to construct more complex skills like problem solving and reasoning. To really understand why facts have to come first, we've got to talk about working memory. Think of this as your brain's mental workspace. It's the area where your active cognitive effort and thinking actually happen. Now imagine you're trying to read, but you have to stop and sound out every single unknown word. You are taking up a massive amount of cognitive space in that working memory. But if you already have prior knowledge of the vocabulary, boom, you instantly free up that workspace. And with a freed up working memory, you can suddenly process much deeper things, like the underlying meaning of the text, the author's tone, or even the humor. 7 plus or minus 2. That is the strict limitation of our working memory. At any given moment, your brain can only actively hold on to about 5 to 9 items. That is a severely limited amount of cognitive real estate. If you overload it, learning just completely stalls out. So the primary goal of learning isn't to just jam more and more stuff into the working memory. It's actually to efficiently move things out of it.
Section 2. The power of practice. Building automaticity.
Let's see how this actually builds. Think back to when you first learned to drive a car. In step 1, your working memory was stretched to the absolute limit, right? You were consciously sweating over the steering wheel, desperately trying to find the right gear, managing the pedals, checking your mirrors, watching the road, all at once. Your brain was using incredibly high effort, and there was zero room left to have a casual chat with the person next to you. But then comes step 2, repeating those actions over months until you achieve what we call automaticity. And finally, step 3. Your working memory is freed. The driving skills have moved to your long-term memory, and suddenly you have the cognitive capacity to effortlessly navigate heavy traffic while having a deep conversation or singing along to the radio. It's like magic, but it's just neuroscience.
But how do we actually build that automaticity? Well, Willingham divides this into practicing knowledge and practicing skills. Practicing knowledge isn't just passively staring at a textbook, it is active repetition. We're talking about using quizzes, flashcards, and past papers over and over until those facts are firmly locked into your long-term memory. Practicing skills, on the other hand, means repeating physical actions. Think practicing swimming strokes or riding a bike every single day until balancing and steering become completely second nature. And why does all this matter for us? Because the end goal of both forms of practice is exactly the same. Clear out that precious working memory so you can tackle higher-level complex problem solving.
Which brings us to a quote that really anchors this entire explainer. Don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. Just take a second to let that sink in. Getting it right once, that just means you succeeded in one specific moment.
Practicing until you literally can't get it wrong means you have achieved true automaticity.
Section 3. Applying theory to teaching, the classroom mechanics.
Okay, first things first, we have to debunk a massive myth in education: learning styles. Yep, you can officially drop the excuse that you were strictly a visual learner. For years, we were all told students are either visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learners, and that teachers should cater to those specific identities. Willingham rejects this entirely. Instead, he champions the reality of appropriate methods. The teaching method shouldn't match the student, it should match the topic itself. If you're teaching the multi-store model of memory, use a visual approach because the topic demands it. If you're teaching social dynamics, like the famous Pilievin study on bystander behavior, use a kinesthetic, role-playing method. Basically, match the tool to the task.
So, what do these actionable strategies look like on the ground? Well, cognitively, teachers really need to pitch lessons at a challenging level. If it's too easy, there's no cognitive effort required, which means no learning actually happens. They should also embed info using frequent low-stakes knowledge tests, like just pausing to ask a student why at the end of a reading point. Now, physically, the strategy shifts. It becomes highly structured. You explain the movements clearly, force repetition over and over, and then slowly layer on new demands to build the skill. For example, teach the fast kick in swimming first, make it automatic, and only then add the arm movements.
Section 4. Developing social skills. Early intervention.
Now here's a really sharp contrast with Piaget. Piaget argued that children are naturally egocentric and can't truly step outside their own perspective until they're around 7 years old. But Willingham, he argues that social friendships and decentering can actually start forming as early as 18 months. That is a staggering difference. But there is a catch. This requires active intervention. Teachers and parents have to actively demonstrate and model social behavior to encourage that social learning through imitation.
And this leads us to a super interesting dynamic regarding self-regulation, which is basically a child's ability to control their impulses. Willingham totally acknowledges the nature side of the debate here. Self-regulation is partially a genetic temperament. Some kids are just naturally more impulsive. But he pairs this immediately with nurture. Even if a trait is genetic, Willingham argues that self-regulation still absolutely must be taught. Let's be real, kids would almost always rather be doing something fun instead of doing work, right? So teachers and parents are required to provide the constant encouragement and emotional support needed to actively develop that self-control over time.
Section 5. Strengths and weaknesses. Evaluating the theory.
Now, what's really interesting is how this theory holds up under scrutiny. Looking at the strengths, this isn't just some abstract philosophy. It is heavily backed by empirical neuroscience. For example, the famous 1993 Edexcel study basically proved that the absolute best violinists were simply the ones who engaged in significantly more practice, period. Willingham's model is also incredibly easy to apply to real-world education through structured lesson plans and feedback. Plus, synthesizing cognitive psychology with actual neuroscience gives us a much fuller picture of the brain. However, looking at the weaknesses, the theory does have some blind spots. Some critics argue it kind of contradicts itself by claiming self-regulation is genetic, yet also insisting it has to be taught. But more importantly, it really seems to ignore the vast differences in individual student abilities. It assumes this uniform speed of learning that, frankly, doesn't exist in reality. And it definitely struggles to address how a child learns if they physically or cognitively cannot copy and practice those specific skills.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to conclude today's explainer. If Willingham is right, and learning relies almost entirely on practice, effort, and achieving automaticity, how do we effectively support those students who are fundamentally unable to easily copy and practice those skills? Does the theory break down, or do our methods of practice simply need to evolve? It's a fascinating limitation of a brilliant theory, and one that challenges all of us to think a whole lot deeper about the actual mechanics of the human mind. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning how you learn.